Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to the Neofusionist Book Review. This is not your typical book review, as I make no claims to political or philosophical impartiality. This podcast uses the format of a book review to explore the premise of neofusionism. Neofusionism is the merging of paleoconservatism with naturalism within the framework of the revitalization of the Republican Party. We will be exploring politics, philosophy, psychology, economics, and sociology through a wide variety of books published both recently and historically. Thank you for tuning in. So for today's episode, we will be looking at a book called The Paleoconservatives, and this was published in 1999, so it's more in the line of this sort of paleoconservative revival, I guess you could call it, that occurred in the 1990s with the, just after the end of the Cold War and with the rise of Pat Buchanan's presidential campaigns, the rise of some new writers. There was sort of this kind of a revival of the old ideas of the old right, and a look back to the early days of the conservative movement and the opposition to World War II, the opposition to the New Deal. That entire era of, say, the first half of the 20th century, even from, say, the presidency of McKinley up through the founding of National Review, that whole era was sort of coming back. Some of those ideas were coming back. And so in the 1990s, there was this sort of revival of the old right. And so for that reason, we've been looking at a number of books that have sort of looked back at that era and also have come up with some new ideas and put those into a new framework of our current political scenario, or what was current in the 1990s, which is not all that far from the situation that we face today. So there are. I keep coming back to Pat Buchanan because to me he kind of was the most prominent face in this movement, and because he put forward a number of fundamental ideas in his campaigns and in his writing that are very important to the present political moment that we find ourselves in. And I think that when I reviewed Day of Reckoning back in episode whatever that was, 4 or 5 something 3, I don't know, so way back when, I guess that was episode 4. He talked about 3 main concepts, and those 3 concepts were isolationism, protectionism, and restrictionism, essentially. So limited foreign engagement, particularly non-interventionism, limited military engagement, but also a drawing back from just our general participation in transnational organizations and reverting to an America First foreign policy. Protectionism, insofar as protecting American markets and protecting American productive capacity, in particular our manufacturing sector, and that sort of economic nationalism or protectionism could also be considered sort of an America First economics. And then with the restrictionism or the nativism or what have you, the reduction of immigration levels and the preservation of and identification of and acknowledgement of and preservation of American culture. And that's also along those America First lines. So the whole notion of paleoconservatism as presented by Pat Buchanan has these sort of defensive, preservative, nationalist, conservative ideas. So I sort of set Pat Buchanan as a figurehead, but there are a bunch of different thinkers, and we've looked at a few of them, and we've looked at the ways that these thinkers have drawn from older thinkers from that old right era. And so this book is called The Paleoconservatives, and so as you can imagine, it's following right along those same lines. This is actually a collection of essays. It doesn't have anything by Buchanan in it. Buchanan isn't really an essay writer in that way, but it does have some interesting writers, some interesting names that we've seen already, and that we will be exploring more deeply in the future. This book is divided into two parts. But before I get into the particulars of this book, I actually want to take a moment to do a bit of a brief review. And I guess I want to do that because I feel like we're on episode 22. This is about as far along as we can get and still do a comfortable review before we just get completely bogged down in episodes. I'm not going to necessarily do a summary of every episode I've done thus far, but I want to kind of trace our path, if you will. So, when we started out, I tried to create a map. I don't know if you remember that. I did the first intro episode, just, here's my basic thesis. But then in the next 4 episodes, I tried to lay out a bit of a map and say, here are some aspects of conservatism and naturalism that I find myself sort of opposed to. Maybe even the prevailing theory of conservatism and the prevailing theory of naturalism that I wanted to differentiate myself from. And then I did 2 more that more closely aligned with how I viewed both naturalism and conservatism. And that was where I did Day of Reckoning and introduced, we're going to be more on the paleoconservative as opposed to the neoconservative, or even as opposed to the standard boilerplate conservatism of your average conservative voter. So differentiating myself and my ideas from that. And then from there, we started to get more into what naturalism proposes, because it proposes a naturalistic, materialistic universe built on the premises of cause and effect, and in which functions are derived by structures exclusively. Everything that operates according to the functions given to it by its structure. In other words, what its structure allows it to do, what its structure doesn't allow it to do, what its structure demands that it does, and demands that it does not do. That's, I guess, the mechanistic aspect of this. So we started to extrapolate that into human evolution, particularly when we got to On Human Nature by E.O. Wilson. And then with Steven Pinker's Blank Slate, we talked more about the concept of there being a specific human nature given to us by evolutionary processes. And what is that nature? But with Steven Pinker's book, we looked particularly at what has been the response to science as scientists put forward this premise. And the response has been largely negative. And that negative response has come from the left, because the political and ideological left does not like the idea of there being a human nature, of there being a particular way about us, as opposed to us just being completely wide open. That's the blank slate theory, that we're blank slates upon which our personalities are crafted by our environment, and therefore, if we control the environment, we can control the people. That's the leftist premise. We can eradicate discrimination, racism, sexism. We can eradicate anger. We can eradicate all bad things in the world by tweaking the environment. People are just putty, and we can set the course of humanity by simply making the right environmental choices. And so the whole concept of there being a hard, fast, hardwired, genetic predisposition towards certain behaviors and certain activities, that's going to go against their narrative. And so at that point, there's a split between the left and science. And while the left to this day claims to be the party of science and largely riding on their appreciation for climate science, which is a significant weak point, in my opinion, in the argument of the right, they win on that issue. But ultimately, when you look at what their philosophy is as regards human beings, which is really what politics is about, in the absence of an environmental crisis, politics is about people and how we behave and how we interact with each other. And the idea that there's a science to that, and there are limits to our behavior and limits to the possibilities of our societies, that's something that the left doesn't support. So I kind of identified that break there, and I think that I found that, and I've been finding that the premise of a science and the findings of science in studying psychology and an evolutionary psychology, they lead to some fundamentally conservative conclusions. And so that's what I want to explore. Not only the fact of human limitation, but the nature of those limitations, the nature of our inclinations, and how our social behavior is guided by evolution, and our tradition is guided by our evolutionarily acquired social behavior. All right, so that brought me up through blank slate. I took a little detour with pragmatism to just basically put out the idea that there is very little human capacity to ascertain absolute truth. Most of the things that we say and do and the ways that we interact with the world depend on approximations. Even epistemologically, there's a conversation in philosophy about whether or not we have the capacity to interact with reality directly. Everything is filtered through our senses, filtered through our limited experiences. Our ability to communicate with other people is filtered through our individual understanding of language, which is not going to be the same for any two people. So there's always a level of misunderstanding because we can't have a perfect mind-to-mind connection. We're filtering through our choice of words. We're filtering through our understanding of words. We're filtering through all of the linguistic baggage, if you will, that comes from having ways to say some things easily and not having ways to say other things easily, because language, to some degree, shapes our thoughts. So there was that. I felt like that was important to get out there. We moved into Conflict of Visions by Thomas Sowell, which brought this into the political more, which said that there are two ways of viewing the world, the constrained and the unconstrained visions. The constrained vision being like what I've just described, although Sowell doesn't necessarily present it in quite the scientific terms, although he hints at it. But the idea that there is a such thing as human nature, and there is a such thing as nature in general, environmental nature, the situation in which we find ourselves is constrained and limited in some manner, and therefore constrains and limits the potential activities of humans. And then there's the unconstrained, right, that kind of says particularly about human nature that we are not constrained in our potential activities, all right? And he uses a few people to illustrate that point. Edmund Burke, Friedrich Hayek, the Founding Fathers, Adam Smith. And these are all people who are sort of considered foundational to conservative thought. And so in that regard, the constrained vision becomes really closely aligned with the conservative vision. And the unconstrained vision is more aligned with the progressive vision. And then we looked at Burke and Paine, The Great Debate by Yuval Levin, which continued this conversation about the difference between Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine. And we focused on Edmund Burke and his ideas of prescription and sort of the value of tradition to provide us with guidance in the absence of perfect human understanding. And so that constrained vision demands that we take knowledge from our fellow humans, that we can't figure everything out on our own because we're constrained. We don't have the capacity. We know a bit of the truth. Somebody else knows a little bit of the truth. Somebody else knows a little bit of the truth. And we put our heads together to try to figure it out. And it's not just you and your neighbors and your fellow countrymen, but it's you and your neighbors and your fellow countrymen and their forefathers and all the people who have come before, and passing that wisdom and knowledge on to all the people who will come after you. Because when you don't have that pure, unrestricted capacity to ascertain absolute truth, you have to depend on everybody's shared approximations and saying, well, do you think it's like this, or do you think it's like this? It kind of seems like it might be like this as we put our heads together and try to figure things out, okay? that is tradition. And so then tradition becomes a vital component of conservatism. All right, we tracked that back in the next book, The Cave and the Light, back to Plato and Aristotle, and we said, okay, Aristotle seems to have a bit of a constrained vision. Plato seems to have a bit of an unconstrained vision. Plato is more of the idealist. He thinks that important things are in the realm of ideas. And Aristotle says, come back down to earth. The important things are the things that happen around you, your behaviors, the behaviors of the people around you. Look, observe first, right? This is empiricism. Observe first, figure out what is going on, and then figure out what you should do. Don't set a vision of what you should do, and then neglecting the way things actually are, attempt to shuffle everything around to fit your vision. That's how Plato works. That's the Platonic method. Conservatism much more closely relies on the Aristotelian approach. And Aristotle is also, through this observational approach, becomes the father of science. And you can kind of see that I'm trying to make a case here that science and conservatism can and should be fundamentally bound together through these principles of pragmatism and empiricism. And so we started to look at the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment was in some ways presented as an Aristotelian approach to the rise of naturalistic science in opposition to Christian dogma, but on the other hand could be seen as an idealistic vision that doesn't necessarily of how people behave, of what human nature is, a proposal of human nature, but maybe a flawed proposal of human nature, and some of the figures that Thomas Sowell had talked about, and some of the ideas that he had talked about as being part of the unconstrained vision, are ideas that are actually, frankly, pretty fundamental to many Enlightenment ideas. So the Enlightenment brought us some good things, and it also brought us some things that we might be skeptical about, and that's where we got to the roots of Romanticism and some of the Romantic skepticism about some of these Enlightenment ideas and the universalism. That was really one thing that I think is very Platonic that came out of the Enlightenment, but it wasn't just born out of Enlightenment, because Christianity is a universalist religion, right? So that universalism of there being one truth for all mankind of Christianity came through the Enlightenment as well. And Romanticism says, well, let's take a minute and think about how every group of people is different, every individual person is different, and let's appreciate the particulars of life. Let's appreciate the differences between people, and not just the ways in which they are the same. And so it's kind of a pluralism, as opposed to the universalism of the Enlightenment. And so there was a sort of sense in which the individual traditions of individual cultures become important in that Romantic view. And so I wanted to look a little bit at traditionalism and maybe even explore some of the metaphysical ideas behind traditionalism. And that was where I got Revolt Against the Modern World, where I talked a little bit about how we view our presence within time. This was a little bit of a tangent, but the whole idea of having a cyclical view of time, I don't necessarily say, oh yes, everything happens exactly the same over and over again. I mean, that's not what I'm saying, but that there's a fundamental rhythm to time, right? The day, the night, etc. You eat, you sleep, you go through these rhythms, you go to work, you go home, and by having that sort of a cyclical approach to time, you gain a sense of belonging somewhere. Whereas a perfectly linear sense of time, of a progressive vision of history is always progressing and changing and moving towards something. There's no sense of home. You're always striving towards something that's not here. And if you ever get there, you'll no longer be progressing. And so it's a vision of perpetual change and becomes therefore rootless. And so that's a sort of a different way of looking at things, but that's a sense of what tradition is bringing us back to what we've done through rituals over and over again, connecting us to our ancestors. It's a cyclical sort of approach to time. And I also looked at being in time to get some more maybe metaphysical ideas about what tradition is. And that's not really deep into tradition, but it kind of provides a bit of a foundation for a sense of being centered and a sense of belonging in the place in which you are. And we talked about some things like thrownness, how you're here, you're where you are, you're who you are. You didn't choose it, it's given to you. And in you being authentic, you have to embrace your thrownness. You have to embrace who you are, where you are, the circumstances of your life. That doesn't mean that you totally embrace stagnation, but you be who you are. That's that same sort of sense of belonging and sense of being home. So anyway, that was sort of a kind of tangential look at some concepts of traditionalism. And I went into In Defense of Tradition by Richard Weaver, who was, we're starting to bring it back now to modernish conservatism. Weaver was writing in the middle of the 20th century, and he was talking a little bit about the ways in which we undermine our own society by trying to change everything all the time. And that's kind of, it's what Socrates was trying to do and why he was killed. You can't want to question everything all the time. Now, this is an issue that can be thorny because in some regards, everything should be up for debate, right? I mean, there shouldn't be anything that we say, no, this idea is not able to be criticized, or this group of people, or whatever. This is off limits. We can have free speech, but you can't criticize X. That's not really how I like to approach things, because I think that we need to have free thought, free speech. But at the same time, when you're questioning everything, you're undermining things by questioning them. And if you question everything all the time, you're damaging society in a sense, because you're not reinforcing the foundations that hold this whole thing together. So that was a bit of that. Then in Defense of Freedom, we looked at the merging of this traditionalist idea that we have been exploring with the idea of freedom that comes more from a libertarian individualist perspective. And that merging of traditionalism and libertarianism was essentially fusionism that was created by Frank Meyer, the author of In Defense of Freedom, and that was the foundation of modern conservatism. Both paleo and neoconservatism spring out of that in one form or another. So I moved on to Reclaiming the American Right, where we start to look more deeply at those roots even before the fusionist movement of the old right, and we see that much of it is very libertarian. It's very anti-war. And then we looked at Ship of Fools. That was sort of a much more modern approach, but it kind of brings in that modern populist idea that is so important to the paleoconservative movement. And then most recently, America First by Bill Kaufman, and that looked at sort of the whole eclectic gamut of different ideas that come to play in the America First movement, the America First mentality, and the paleoconservative mentality. Although I don't think he uses, I guess he talks about paleoconservatism to some extent. He does talk about Pat Buchanan in that book, because Pat Buchanan has, attached so much of his ideas to the concept of America First. But he also looked at like the America First Committee from back in World War II, or right before we participated in World War II. And just kind of an across the board look at patriotism and love of country and love of fellow citizens that can and should infuse any sort of an America First mentality. So that brings us up to where we are. All right, so I've already banged out quite a bit of my episode so far with that extensive review, but as we move forward, we're gonna explore more of these concepts in more detail, and I feel like we need to kind of keep ourselves grounded in what our objective is here. So we have been over the last number of episodes, we've been really laying out what paleoconservatism is, what traditionalism is. We haven't really got into the libertarian side an awful lot, although we did a little bit as far as the anti-war, anti-interventionism, the isolationism, things like that. We haven't necessarily got into libertarian economics yet. We will. But we're trying to paint a picture of paleoconservatism, which is a big tent, and there's all these different ideas that get mixed up in there, and trying to find, what are the different connections, and is paleoconservatism really fusionism or what? So this book, The Paleoconservatives, clearly continues to follow along those lines. It won't be too long here before we start working our way back to naturalism. I'm sure you're probably wondering, where's the naturalism? This all seems about politics, and ultimately it is about politics, but the paleoconservative temperament and ideas are grounded in naturalism, and that's the case that I'm trying to make. And so once I get this really kind of fleshed out and defined the way I want it to be, we will dive deeper into naturalism and evolutionary psychology and the human mind and how it works and why it fits so snugly with a paleoconservative disposition. All right, so now that I've gotten all that out of the way, where I was looking at these two different parts, part 1 and part 2 of this book. Part 1 is called Founding Fathers, and part 2 is called A Resurgent Old Right. And Founding Fathers has essays from folks back in the middle of the 20th century. You've got Murray Rothbard and Frank Chodorov, both bringing a very libertarian perspective. So it's definitely along the lines that this old right movement was fundamentally libertarian. You've got James Burnham, who it's kind of an interesting mix you get here, because Meyer criticized Rothbard for being too libertarian. Meyer was trying to make that fusion of traditionalism and libertarianism. So anybody that was either too traditionalist or too libertarian and wasn't really hitting that middle ground or synthesis that he thought was so important in bringing together the various components of American political thought that would be necessary to oppose the New Deal and the New Deal era and the big government era, he would criticize them. And so we've got Rothbard in here. James Burnham was criticized as being part of the new right back in Reclaiming the American Right. But James Burnham, he was a fusionist. He was a former communist and fusionist. We're not going to read those essays. Also in here is Russell Kirk. Russell Kirk is a traditionalist who was criticized by Meyer for being too far on that side of the spectrum. And then we've got Richard Weaver. We've looked at Weaver already when we read In Defense of Freedom. He's got an essay in here. Of these Founding Fathers essays, I do want to read a section of one of them. I want to read a section of Russell Kirk's essay, The Question of Tradition, because I think that the traditional aspect of this is important. And in a couple of books recently, we've looked at some of the more libertarian ideas. We've kind of been bouncing back and forth, but regardless, I find this an interesting essay, and so I do want to touch on it. And I haven't really talked about Russell Kirk yet. But then we're going to go to part 2, A Resurgent Old Right, which really is newer authors. These are all authors writing in the 90s. And they talk about a few different points here. The first essay is called Promises to Keep by Chilton Williamson Jr., and that is about immigration and restricting immigration, not just illegal immigration, but restricting immigration in general, which I think is a very valid and important aspect to paleoconservatism and a conversation that needs to be had. After that, I'm not going to talk about it, though. I've got limited time. I want to talk about this next one, the anti-history of free trade ideology. This is very important to me, and I think it's very important to our political moment right now, about the break in the conservative movement between free trade, global free trade, which is the neoconservative perspective, and protectionism, which is the paleoconservative perspective. Free trade, global free trade, has been dominant, as the neoconservatives have been dominant, for decades, for nearly 100 years. Even in the 90s, when this paleoconservative revival was happening, they didn't really acquire power. So the free trade ideology has been dominant, but this author, William Hawkins, makes a really good case as to why free trade ideology is actually destructive. And so I'm going to read a little bit out of that. There are a few more authors: Alan Carlson, M.E. Bradford, Thomas Fleming, Paul Gottfried. Of those, the last two, Thomas Fleming and Paul Gottfried, I've got a few other books by those authors that I want to read, I want to get to. So I'm not going to read their essays now. What I do want to read a bit from is Restoring the Republic by Clyde Wilson, and this takes a sort of a populist position. So that's another one of these isms, I guess, these ideas that floats around in the paleoconservative landscape. And then finally, there's an essay I want to read a portion of by Samuel Francis, and it is called Nationalism, Old and New. And he takes a more, maybe it's hard line stance. I would say maybe it's more slightly Machiavellian and not quite so skeptical of big government as some of the other authors that are in here and some of the other authors that we've looked at. So that makes, 4 essays that I want to touch on out of the 13 essays in this book. But I want to start off with a section from the introduction. Before I get to anything else, fairly brief section. And this is going to just kind of ground us in what paleoconservatism is and its relation to the history of the conservative movement. And this is the editor, Joseph Scotchie, talking. And he says, quote, "Paleoconservatism is a phrase that came into circulation during the 1980s, perhaps as a rejoinder to the rise of neoconservative influence on the American right. More importantly, it is mean to signify a brand of conservatism whose roots reach back to before both the Cold War and even World War II. As such, paleoconservatives readily accept the much-used label Old Right, so as to identify themselves in part with the conservatism that arose in opposition to the New Deal. Paleoconservatism has been influenced by several European thinkers and epochs in history. Edmund Burke, the 19th century English statesman whose preference for a rural, hierarchical order, and in general the non-materialistic things in life, long inspired Russell Kirk and other traditionalists who came of age in the 1950s. Meanwhile, Kirk's friend, Richard Weaver, going back further in time, found a usable past in the chivalry of the Middle Ages, qualities that Weaver believed could be transported to the modern world. Other major influences on the old right are classical. Russell Kirk's opus, The Roots of American Order, singles out the example of the ancient Hebrews, Greeks, notably Plato and Aristotle, Romans, and the England that emerged during the 14th century for molding the American character. Likewise, M.E. Bradford has cited the Roman Republic, with its durable and impressive social organisms, for exerting a great influence on the Founding Fathers. A good Roman of the old school has personal pride and a considerable sense of honor, Bradford writes. His was a shame culture, dominated by intense and personally felt loyalties to family, clan, and individual. Commitment to Rome had its roots in these most primary attachments. Such were virtues that the founders, especially George Washington, aspired to emulate. In modern times, such European Catholics and Anglo-Catholics as G.K. Chesterton, Joseph de Maistre, and T.S. Eliot have served as similar inspirations for paleoconservatives. Also, from the continent, the free-market, anti-statist Austrian school, made famous by Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, and Henry Hazlitt, became the intellectual model for an economic and social alternative to New Deal state planning. By the 1990s, such labels as reactionary, and especially traditionalist, held more appeal to the old right than mere conservatism, since many of them wondered what exactly there was left to conserve from contemporary American culture. Many of the old right's antecedents have been American. Modern conservatism has always had a strong Southern influence. The decentralizing tenets of Thomas Jefferson, John Randolph of Roanoke, and John C. Calhoun are held up as 18th and 19th century models of responsible statesmanship. The revolt of the Vanderbilt agrarians, especially that of Andrew Lytle and Donald Davidson, against large-scale industrialization, is also a cherished legacy for paleoconservatives. In addition, small r Republicans, those opponents of a budding American empire, have seen their reputations refurbished by paleoconservative writers. They include William Jennings Bryan, the fiery Midwestern populist, Idaho Senator William J. Borah, who fought Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations plan, and William J. Fulbright, the Arkansas Solon who expressed grave reservations about the Johnson administration's escalation in Vietnam, while denouncing an arrogance of empire that had captured Washington policymakers and legislators alike. A post-Cold War foreign policy that combines a strong national defense and a nation free of such globalist organizations as the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization has been a good enough model for the old right. A defense of the nation's varied and colorful regional cultures animates the old right's opposition to the centralizing trends that defined most 20th century politics. Culture means celebrating American regionalism. For instance, Robert Frost's New England, the Old South of William Faulkner, and New South of Walker Percy, plus the West, as portrayed in the novels of Edward Abbey, to even such forgotten Midwestern novelists as Louis Bromfield and Glenn Way Westcott. On the grounds that America was not a universal nation, but instead an extension of an Anglo-Saxon Celtic civilization also influenced by Athens, Rome, and Jerusalem, the old right first gained real notoriety by opposing massive third world immigration into the United States. End quote. So there, he kind of lays out some of the influences, the importance of decentralization, and not just decentralization, but regionalism, the value of independent regions in the United States that each have their own distinct cultures and don't necessarily want to be or shouldn't be homogenized into some sort of blanket American culture. The distinctions and the particularities are important for the paleoconservatives. So you get the Austrian school insofar as the libertarian economics, which we'll get into, and there's conflict between some of that and say the protective economics that are discussed in this book. Obviously, there are going to be differences of opinion between different people who consider themselves paleoconservatives. All right, so at this point, I am going to get into the 4 different essays that I want to read. This is obviously going to be a longer episode, given that I spent so long on that review, but I did feel it was important. So, we're going to move at this point into Russell Kirk's essay, The Question of Tradition. He says, quote, "Is it possible to revive a sense of traditions among a crowd who have forgotten the whole concept of tradition? The thinking conservative believes so. The work must be slow and subtle, but here I suggest some of the aspects of the undertaking. Number 1, a reaffirmation of the truth that lies in tradition. The conservative will contend against the presumption of intellectuals who think that all wisdom comes from pure rationality and formal schooling. He will assure men, with Pascal, that the heart has reasons which the reason knows not, and that the immemorial customs and beliefs of a people ordinarily have meaning and value in them, whether or not we can express them by pure reason. Number 2, a defense of the classes and regions in which tradition still is a living force. The conservative will do everything in his power to prevent the further diminution of our rural population. He will recommend decentralization of industry and deconcentration of population. He will seek to keep as many men and women as possible close to the natural and customary world in which tradition flourishes. This will not be an artificial reaction against a natural process of consolidation, for our intensive industrialization and urbanization from the days of Hamilton to the Vietnamese War have been deliberate policies encouraged by state and national governments and by great corporate bodies. If we were to apply half as much energy and thought to the preservation of rural life and the old structure of community as we have put to consolidation, we might be as well balanced in these relationships as is Switzerland. Number 3, a humanization of urban life. bringing to the city man a sense of continuity. It is not impossible for urban people to have their traditions, though tradition finds the country more congenial. In America, our towns have thrown all their influence behind a deliberate disruption of old ways and things, commonly. In an Idaho town recently, it was proposed that the trees in the public square be sawed down and a parking lot established there. Someone protested, and a member of the city council, a shopkeeper, was astounded that there should be any objection. Why, some of those trees are as much as 30 years old. Whatever had roots and age, in this energument's view, ought to be extirpated as anti-progressive. Half the battle for tradition of townsfolk would be won by a simple change of attitude. The preservation of old houses and neighborhoods, for instance, is a buttress of tradition in general, but most city planners and traffic engineers desire to sweep away every vestige of past generations. With the physical past, they abolish the sense of continuity very commonly. Number 4. The returning to family and church and voluntary association of their old responsibilities as transmitters of tradition. The arrogant claim of many educationalists that they have a right to train the whole child and to form his character and opinions regardless of the prejudices of his family and his church and all the older agencies for education must be denied by the conservative. Parents ought to be encouraged to instruct their children in moral traditions, in the disciplines of private conduct, and in the ways of the world. Churches ought to be supported in their endeavors to make religious knowledge the most important part of any educational system. The formal agencies of the state cannot convey to young people in any satisfactory degree a sense of continuity and the eternal contract, and we ought to confess this and restore to other and older agencies the duties which should never have been taken from them. A dismal, compulsory salute to the flag and mumbled collective pledge of allegiance to an abstract state is a wretched substitute for the feeling of loyalty which grows out of love of family and love of local community. End quote. So he points out four tasks here that I'll review real quickly as to what to do to restore tradition. Number 1 would be a reaffirmation that tradition contains truth. And this ties back in with some of the other books that we've read, so I'm not going to belabor the point, but essentially the idea that tradition contains knowledge that has been accrued bit by bit, very carefully and very deliberately over many generations, and it's not the case that one person's reason, or even a council of people's reason and rationality, is necessarily superior to the collected wisdom of the ages. The second would be a defense of classes and regions in which tradition is still a living force. So this is sort of the idea that if there is an institution, a region, or whatever that embraces tradition, it must be protected and secured with a fighting spirit. And Russell Kirk lays this out as being the rural areas of the world being more closely aligned with tradition. And I think that may be largely the case. But we need to grab it where we can find it. Wherever there is tradition that is being preserved, that should be valued and protected. The third thing would be a humanization of urban life. This comes to some degree to some of the ideas of Jane Jacobs, who is sometimes considered a progressive. I don't know as though she really identified herself one way or the other. We're going to be looking at Jane Jacobs down the road, but it's really just the idea that, well, cities have traditions, cities have histories, urban areas, towns, not just big cities, but your town. So it's not just a matter of, oh, this is all found out in the countryside and the cities are a lost cause. The cities are not a lost cause. And so there's an outreach element involved in this, in setting up traditional and reinforcing traditional ideas within urban areas. And then the fourth, and one that is going to be the most challenging and important for us in this podcast at least, is the returning to family and church and voluntary association of their old responsibilities as transmitters of tradition. So, These are the institutions outside of the government, outside of government schools. This is civil society, voluntary associations that have maintained traditions from time immemorial. And they should be given the opportunity and the capacity to pass these traditions on. They need to be embraced for what they do as carriers of tradition, and they need to be allowed to pass these traditions on. Now, obviously, if you've been following the podcast at all, you know that I'm juggling two different things here. On the one hand, religious institutions serve a vital role in holding communities together, in providing a sense of meaning to people's lives, and in codifying rituals that connect us to our past, our ancestors. Rituals are a fundamental part of tradition. At the same time, many of the doctrines of these religious institutions are not actually correct when it comes to where man comes from, the nature of reality, the nature of the planet Earth. And I know that there are many people who will just say, well, religion fits in those areas that science can't explain, like where did the Big Bang come from? Why did that happen? How did that happen? How is any of this even here? How is it so beautiful for us to experience? How can we have things that all of these point to a spiritual or a religious experience? But that's not really what the Bible says. That's not necessarily how these religious institutions have historically, for centuries, presented their religious perspectives. It's doctrine. This happened. Jesus Christ rose from the dead. He came to earth to sacrifice himself, or God sent him here to sacrifice himself to save us and redeem us from our sins. That is the story, okay, that is presented. It's not just... So religion has these multiple functions, part of which is to tell us the nature of reality and the nature of our purpose here. What are we doing here? What is our objective? Is there another world that we're trying to get to? Is there a heaven and a hell? All these concepts about reality. That is a separate thing from the fact that it serves this almost utilitarian function in providing a glue to bind society together. So these two different things have to be balanced in a way that is not going to tear apart the fabric of society. So that's the challenge. And that's part of the challenge of what I'm trying to do with this podcast. And it's not the sort of thing that I'm just going to be able to lay out nice and simply, because I'm still researching this myself. I'm still trying to figure this all out and piece it all together. But so I just wanted to mention those 4 points because I think they're all important and they point to some of the greater challenges that we face. So I'm going to move on to the next essay, the anti-history of free trade ideology. So now we've moved into the more modern writers, and we're hitting a few of the core points. Now, those 3 points that were made by Patrick Buchanan that I mentioned earlier, the isolationism, protectionism, and restrictionism, those all kind of fall under the auspice of nationalism and as well as paleoconservatism. Those are the points that are being made now and the things that need to be addressed now, because those are the crises that we face now, and it just so happens that the paleoconservative solutions are the correct solutions to these problems. And here we lay out one of them, and that is the case for protectionism and the problems that we face with global free trade. So, this is by William Hawkins, and he says, quote, "While free traders, such as the French economist Jean-Baptiste Say, author of the classical paradigm Say's Law of Markets, believed that all nations are friends in the nature of things, their opponents on the right considered economics a vital foundation of national strength in a world where international competition decided not just the fate of business enterprises, but that of entire societies. The 19th century saw an intense debate between these points of view in Europe. A debate that generated most of the theories and lines of arguments used, consciously or unconsciously, by those engaged in debate over American trade policy in the late 20th century. Free trade was then rooted in the then new school of classical liberalism of England and France. Nationalist thought drew on the ancient practices of mercantilism, enlivened by insights from contemporary American and German thinkers, though all nations had adherents of both doctrines. Friedrich List is the best-known nationalist writer. Forced into exile from his native Württemberg because of his advocacy of industrialization and a common commercial union of the many states that then comprised Germany, List came to the United States at the suggestion of General Lafayette, who introduced him to Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, James Madison, and other national leaders. List found in the previous works of Alexander Hamilton a line of reasoning similar to his own. His pen was soon employed supporting the U.S. policy of protective tariffs against protests from British manufacturers, who then dominated world markets. He saw in the United States the best model for economic progress and joined several groups promoting science and industry. Returning to Europe as an American diplomat, he promoted railway projects in Germany and joined the battle over trade policy with a barrage of articles and pamphlets culminating in the National System of Political Economy, a massive work that pitted history and realpolitik against the abstract theories and idealism of the classical liberals. End quote. So there he's got a little bit about Friedrich List, who's a very important figure. We'll be coming back to him periodically, both reading that book that he mentioned and reading about him a little bit in some other books where we discuss protectionism. So he's an important figure, and it's important to note that the nationalist perspective is very different from a perspective that presumes a state of cooperation and peaceful interaction between all nations of the earth. That's idealism. That's not realism. That's not the way the world works. The world functionally is constituted by a series of nation states that are competing for power. And while economic wealth is not necessarily a zero-sum game that different nations can both advance, that the advancement, the increase in wealth of one nation doesn't necessarily come at the expense of the decrease of wealth of another nation, it is the case that economic power is a zero-sum game. The more powerful one nation becomes in the global arrangement of nations and military arrangements as well, which rely upon strong economies to provide the backbone of the military, that is a zero-sum game. When one nation gets more powerful, other nations get less powerful by comparison. It's relative power. So the nationalist perspective is rooted in the reality observed, the observable reality of the state of the world, and not rooted in some sort of idealistic vision of the way nations should interact. All right? So then he's going to leave List behind for a moment and talk about Adam Smith. He says, quote, "The 19th century liberals drew on Adam Smith, depicting the wealth of nations as a work of doctrinaire free trade thinking. They were only partially correct. Smith did, in standard liberal fashion, denounce the capricious ambitions of kings and ministers and the mean rapacity, the monopolizing spirit of merchants and manufacturers who had prospered under mercantilism. Yet he did not take the final leap into cosmopolitan pacifist ideology common to those further to the left. He thought the art of war is certainly the noblest of all arts, and that England must be prepared for war, because a wealthy nation is of all nations the most likely to be attacked. In a famous passage, Smith wrote that defense, however, is of much more importance than opulence, a statement with which any mercantilist would agree." End quote. So there you see that Adam Smith, who's generally kind of trotted out as the harbinger of the invisible hand of markets and the value of free trade, recognized that that nations don't necessarily operate under the same system that merchants do, because nations have to be able to defend themselves, and therefore the industries that are necessary for national defense are more important than the opulence of pure consumption. So that the aggregate consumption demands of the people of a nation are not adequate to provide for the national defense. There are some industries that have to be protected in order to, in the case of England, this was shipbuilding at that time, that England needed to have laws that would protect and support its shipbuilding industries. And so it wasn't just subject to free trade. So at that point, we begin to look at Alexander Hamilton. So Adam Smith, Friedrich List, and Alexander Hamilton are sort of the main figures in this conversation. So when he talks about Alexander Hamilton, he says, quote, "Across the Atlantic, American statesmen had a different agenda than the classical liberals. Their goal was not to fragment an empire, but to build one, to unite 13 former colonies into a nation that could expand across a continent and develop its abundant resources. One of these seminal documents of American history is the Report on Manufactures, written in 1791 by Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury in President George Washington's administration. In it, Hamilton laid out the economic foundation of the new republic: balanced growth between the industrializing North and the agricultural South. Each section would be the best customer of the other. Ideas of contrariety of interests between the northern and southern regions of the Union are as unfounded as they are mischievous," he declared. "Mutual wants constitute one of the strongest links of political connection. The Constitution embodies this thinking. Article 1, Section 10 removes the power to regulate interstate commerce from the states, thus creating a large internal market free of local barriers." He goes on to say, quote, "In pursuit of economic growth, Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, including the enactment of tariffs on imports. Section 9, however, prohibits the levying of taxes on exports. The clear purpose of treating imports and exports differently is that the former are to be controlled, the latter encouraged. James Madison, speaking at the Constitutional Convention, defended tariffs as necessary for revenue, domestic industry, and to procure equitable regulations from other countries. All three of these functions have been obscured in recent years." End quote. So at this point, he begins to bring the conversation back to the present moment and the situation, or at least to the present moment as existed in 1999, and the issues that he describes have only gotten worse in the 20 years since then. He says, quote, "This discussion of the historical roots of today's free trade philosophy is relevant on practical as well as intellectual grounds. As the British economic historian Charles Wilson has noted, the move towards a new mercantilism has accelerated in most of the world, the result being the tendency of international trade to revert to conditions which in some ways resemble those of the 17th century rather than those of the 19th. The oil shocks of the 1970s started this trend, but it has been reinforced by the aggressive commercial policies of Japan and the East Asian mini-dragons, and has been further advanced by the formation of the giant United European Economic Bloc. The collapse of communism in Eastern Europe has opened a whole new world of intense competition between American, West European, and Asian firms which cannot be isolated from their political diplomatic ramifications. The object is not to suspend trade, but to manage it in ways that support the advancement of the national economy. Just as arms control agreements do not automatically produce peace and security, trade agreements do not automatically produce jobs and profits. It is all in the details. The wise policymaker knows that the game of international economics is competitive in the fullest meaning of the term. While there can be mutual gains from particular transactions, overall, trade can be very asymmetrical in its effects, producing losers as well as winners. In a whole host of strategic economic sectors, the expansion of one nation's market share comes at the expense of the share held by its rivals. Since no people can live beyond their ability to produce, the battle is for control of the most productive industries and for a position from which future technological advances can be made. The United States, with the world's largest domestic market, a skilled workforce, and an established techno-industrial base, has every inherent advantage in this global contest. It only needs leaders in government who understand that the game is being played for very high stakes. He goes on to say, quote, "The collapse of nations and civilizations is usually thought of in terms of cataclysmic events, such as defeat in war. Yet such dramatics are only the climax of a much larger, longer process, the result of decades of gradual economic decline, often accompanied by domestic turmoil or political paralysis. The formal shifts in territory and institutional dominance are merely the surface phenomenon that ratify the underlying balance of power. The more decisive changes take the form of indirect control of external resources and industry, land and people, through trade and investment, the factors that create the balance of power." He says, quote, "The objective is not to either stifle or promote trade. Trade is a means, not an end in itself. Every great nation has engaged in trade, but those that have benefited have used trade to enhance the strength of their own economy. They have not surrendered their sovereignty to the traders. They have managed trade so as to advance their own interests in the face of rivals who are trying to do the same. The composition and direction of trade is thus more important than its volume. This is how the balance of power turns. New powers arise, which eventually convert their economic gains into political and military power. The older power then suddenly finds that it no longer has the strength to prevail against overt challenges. Such a change in the balance of power is seldom due to the energetic actions of the challenger alone. More often than not, the challenger's victory was only made possible by the failure of the older power to respond while it was still in a dominant position. The leaders of the older power were either blind to the developing threat, preoccupied with internal affairs, or simply apathetic to external events, or so overly optimistic in their assessment of the margin of safety available that they failed to act until it was too late. Leaders are seldom so irresponsible as to simply not care about the outcome of such contests, though that is the reckless advice being pushed today by the free trade lobby. Free traders never learn from history because they intend to transcend the past. Their doctrine is based on ideology, not analysis or experience. It is a leap of faith, predicated on the notion that the world has or is about to assume a new order. A world without borders will replace nationalistic fetishes, to use too frequent liberal phrases. Yet a review of the last 5 centuries reveals that those making this prediction have been proven wrong time after time. Free trade is a true sophistry, an idea that sounds plausible in theory, but which proves fallacious in practice. It has been consistently associated with the decline of nations at the hands of their more cunning rivals. Yet its appeal continues because its advocates, like the ancient sophists, couch their rhetoric in terms of unlimited progress and a basic revolution in human affairs. But wise and practical statesmen should know the difference between dreams and reality." End quote. So that just kind of reiterates what I was saying about how this free trade ideology is rooted in a belief about the nature of the world that is flatly untrue, but it kind of drives toward some future state at which the world is operating in this globally synchronous type of scenario. But it's foolish. It's foolish. The world doesn't work like that. And if we ever get there, maybe it'll be good. I'm not so sure that it even would be good. So let's concern ourselves with the state of the world as it is, which is fundamentally competitive. So with that said, I'm going to move to another essay here called Restoring the Republic by Clyde Wilson. Now, this one has a sort of a populist feel to it. And like I said earlier, populism is an important part of the paleoconservative movement. Now, has it always been? Is it always in every circumstance? Maybe not. But I think nowadays in the modern paleoconservative movement, the populist sentiment is very important. And as we can see by this essay's inclusion in this book, it was important in the 1990s as well. So this author, whose name is Clyde Wilson, in his essay called Restoring the Republic, he says, quote, "Again and again, we have seen the self-government of the American people frustrated by the few, the oligarchy, in the name of rational democracy. This is the problem of republicanism in our time, our chief dilemma in society and government, the consolidation of power in the hands of the few. It explains that, while sophisters, whenever they raise their snouts from the public trowel long enough, shout hosannas to the triumph of democracy, the American people everywhere have ceased to believe that the government they elect is really theirs, or that they will be allowed to make the institutions ostensibly theirs respond to their will. Everywhere an ideological construct mislabeled democracy has triumphed, and everywhere the people feel powerless. For those who really value the rule of the people, as well as the special constitutional heritage of American federal republicanism, the task of the day is not to spread democracy about the world while we congratulate ourselves on our success. The task is to restore the federal republic at home. In order to carry out this task, we will need the spirit of liberty that animated generations of our forefathers, not an obeisance to their forms, but an imitation of their spirit. For forms may survive while the soul is fled from them. What we need is a return of power to the many, not a concentration of power in the hands of the few for the alleged benefit of the many, abstractly conceived. That way lies Hitler and Stalin. Rather, a dispersal and deconsolidation of power. Only power can check power. And self-government is, in its nature, local and individual. Only then is it real. For our fathers, liberty consisted in a negative upon government. It was not a boon bestowed by government, but something that must be asserted against government. It will not increase the power and liberty of American families in the least, for the government to bestow upon them a voucher to spend on a limited choice of schools under stipulated requirements. It will, rather, further consolidate power and further intrude the government into as yet unregulated spheres of life. The only way to increase the power and liberty of the family is not to collect the taxes and not to lay down the regulations to begin with. Both our governing parties agree on the consolidation of power. They argue only over marginal aspects of administration. Unlike us, the attitude of our founders toward democracy was not ideological and not self-congratulatory. They believed in the right of those who were capable of governing themselves to do so. They were pleased that Americans had the fortunate opportunity to live under self-government at a time when, unlike today, most of the world was hostile to the very idea. They hoped they might set an example for oppressed mankind. They did not entertain a duty to spread democracy about the world by fire, sword, harangue, and money. They were the opposite of self-congratulatory and arrogant. Their demeanor was cautious, monitory, and self-demanding. "Well, gentlemen," Dr. Franklin is supposed to have said at the Philadelphia Convention, "you have made a republic if you can keep it." If Republican self-government was to survive, if Americans were to go on governing themselves, then government must be watched. Republican liberty could always be subverted by lust for power on the part of the cunningly ambitious few, and by the decay of those strenuous and demanding virtues among the many that made self-government possible. When our fathers spoke of America as an experiment, they did not mean a glorious mission of revolution. They meant an experiment in the exercise and preservation of Republican virtues. End quote. So this is essentially a statement that the concepts of small government and decentralization are actually fundamental to self-rule. That in order to be as close as possible to self-rule, you need to have as large as possible in the affairs of your life. And when the state government or the local government is more powerful than the central federal government, then you have more capacity to set the course of your environment. And so that notion of self-rule is fundamental to small government conservative thought. And he essentially paints this as a struggle between the many and the few. The powerful few have control over the federal government, have control over the major institutions of our lives, and the more centralized power becomes, the more power those few people in control wind up getting. To me, this is fairly self-explanatory, but when you look at the Bernie Sanders of the world or the various socialist schemes, they always seem to consolidate more power into the federal government. That's not really self-rule, and it creates a state of the many being dependent upon the few, which is not really. I mean, that's a Band-Aid at best for the common people to be lifted up by the largest of the richest people in the country or in the world, and this dependence that's so contrary to the notion of self-rule. And so for paleoconservatism to thrive, it has to be able to create the message that says you are only going to thrive as a member of the 99% when you have the capacity to thrive, the freedom to thrive, the space necessary to do your thing, if you will. And the more constrained you are, and the more dependent you are, the more you're going to be like a hamster in a cage. You get fed every day, but you're not free, and that dependency is not what's going to lift up the common man. Dependency will never lift anybody up. It's capacity that will lift people up. Competence and capacity for them to be able to lift themselves up, because that is true freedom and true prosperity. So it's a sort of a right-wing populism, right-wing populist idea, and the whole essay is great. There was another significant section here that I thought about reading, but I don't want this episode to take forever, but I do recommend that you pick this book up so that you can see the entirety of that essay and the others. And then lastly, I just want to cover a part here. This is not a particularly long section that I'm going to read out of this last essay. It's the last essay in the book, and it's called Nationalism, Old and New by Sam Francis, and he sort of draws a picture that is contrary to the one that I just drew. He essentially says that the situation is relatively dire, and it is necessary for the middle class of America that is being hollowed out, that the America is becoming a land of haves and have-nots, and the middle class, the have-somes, but don't own everything. They're not the 1%, but they're also not the poverty-stricken. This is a fundamental component of a healthy nation, is to have a middle class, and a strong, robust middle class. And so for the preservation of this middle class, it is necessary to employ the power of the state and not to simply dismantle the state. And so he's a little more skeptical of the small government approach. And I think it's interesting. I in some respects I agree. In some respects I'm skeptical. I tend to be more of a small government person myself, but he makes a good case. So I'm going to read this section to you, and you can take from it what you wish. He says, quote, "What a new middle American nationalism must seek is a redefinition of nationalism away from the terms of the old. Since a Middle American nationalism bases itself on the actual interest and norms of a concrete social group, it will not display the same adversarial alienation that affected the pseudo-nationalism it seeks to replace, nor will it need to rely on the power of the national state to the same degree or in the same way. Nevertheless, the mission of the new nationalism must not be merely the winning of formal political power through elections and roll call votes, but also the acquisition of substantive social power and the displacement of the incumbent managerial elite of the regime by its own elite drawn from and representing Middle American social stratum. No social group becomes an elite unless it makes use of the instruments of force that are at the heart of the state, and hence a Middle American nationalism cannot expect to achieve its goals unless it employs the state to reward its own socio-political base and exclude its rivals from access to rewards. A Middle American nationalism must expect to redefine legal rules, political procedures, fiscal and budgetary mechanisms, and national policy generally in the interests of Middle Americans, and it must do so with no illusions about rejecting, decentralizing, or dismantling the national state or the power it affords. Middle American interests are dependent on the national state through various educational, fiscal, trade, and economic instruments, and a Middle American nationalism ought to announce an explicit agenda of consolidating and enhancing these instruments. At the same time, a new nationalism must recognize that many of the organs of the national state exist only to serve the interests of the incumbent elite and its underclass allies. The arts and humanities endowments, and most or all of the Department of Education, Labor, Commerce, Housing and Urban Development, and Health and Human Services, and the civil rights enforcement agencies in various departments, and it should seek their outright abolition, as well as that of those agencies and departments in their national security bureaucracy that serve globalist and anti-nationalist agendas. But power based merely on the state is insufficient for the reconstitution of American society under Middle American dominance. State power, indeed, though a prerequisite for the emergence of a new elite, is by itself a weak support, and it must be supplemented by cultural dominance. Under the incumbent elite and its regime, characteristically Middle American norms of sacrifice for and solidarity with family, community, ethnicity, nation, religion, and morals, and their rules of taste and propriety are under continuous attack, subversion, and delegitimization by the cultural and intellectual vanguards of the elite. In place of such norms, the elite offers an ethic of hedonism, immediate gratification, and cosmopolitan or universalist dispersion of concrete identities and loyalties, an ethic that serves the interest of the incumbent elite by encouraging a passive and homogenized, though fragmented, culture of continuous consumption, distraction, entertainment, self-indulgence, surrender of social responsibilities to mass organizations, and the erosion of the concrete social identities and intermediary institutions that restrain the centralized manipulative power of both political and corporate structures. By far, the most strategically important effort of an emerging Middle America counter-elite would be a long countermarch through the institutions of the dominant elite, universities, think tanks and foundations, schools, the arts, journalism, organized religion, the professions, labor organizations, and corporations, not only to assert the legitimacy of Middle American cultural and ethnic identity, norms, and institutions, but also to define American society in terms of them. Instead of an ethic of acquisitive individualism, immediate and perpetual gratification, distraction, and dispersion, the new nationalism should assert an ethic of solidarity and sacrifice able to discipline and direct national energy and reinforce national, social, and ethnic bonds of identity. The pseudo-nationalist ethic of the old nationalism that served only as a mask for the pursuit of special interests will be replaced by the social ethic of an authentic nationalism that can summon and harness the genius of a people certain of its identity and its destiny. The myth of the managerial regime, that America is merely a philosophical proposition about the equality of all mankind, and therefore includes all mankind, must be replaced by a new myth of the nation as a historically and culturally unique order that commands loyalty, solidarity, and discipline, and excludes those who do not or cannot assimilate to its norms and interests. This is the real meaning of America First. America must be first not only among other nations, but first also among the other individual or class or sectional interests of its people. Unless a Middle American nationalism or any other socio-political movement can achieve such cultural hegemony through the formulation of an accepted public myth, its political power and economic resources will remain dependent on the cultural power of its adversaries, and eventually will succumb to their manipulation as it takes its cues on goals and tactics from its opponents. If a new Middle American nationalism is in some respects a synthesis and a transcendence of the conventional poles of right and left, it is also, in another sense, a resolution of the popular conflict between the classical republicanism and the nationalism around which so much of American political history has swung. Like the nationalist tradition, it concerns itself with the pragmatic defense of national interests in foreign affairs, military security, and political economy. But unlike the old nationalism, it perceives a national interest, beyond this pragmatic dimension, in the preservation of the distinctive cultural and ethnic foundations of nationality, recognizing that pragmatic, material, and economic considerations may and should defer to the more central norms without which pragmatism is merely a meaningless process. The affirmation of national and cultural identity as the core of the new nationalist ethic acquires special importance at a time when massive immigration, a totalitarian and anti-white multiculturalist fanaticism, concerted economic warfare by foreign competitors, and the forces of anti-national political globalism continue to jeopardize the cultural identity, demographic existence, economic autonomy, and national independence and sovereignty of the American nation. Like the Republican tradition, the new nationalism is essentially populist in tactics, locating the cultural and moral core of contemporary American society in a stratum that is the main victim of the regime that now prevails in the United States. Like republicanism also, it is less interested in the abstract pursuit of luxury and empire than in the defense of the characteristic norms and identity of the people it defines and represents. And like republicanism, it calls that people to a duty higher than mere accumulation and aggrandizement, to a destiny of knowing who they are, where they came from, and what they can be. If they remain able to answer that call, they and their posterity may yet achieve both a virtue and a power that neither old Republicans nor old nationalists were ever able to create." End quote. So he has a kind of interesting balance that he talks about toward the end of that. Well, in the beginning part, as I was saying, he talks about seizing power over the state and not dismantling it, but using it to advance the interests of Middle America, which I think we can take to mean the middle economic class of America, the average working American person who's not a member of the so-called elite, but who is also not a member of a purely dependent underclass, as he refers to it. And certainly we want to concern ourselves with the interests of all Americans. We don't want to have a view of the nation that is fundamentally fragmented, I don't believe. But given the fact that as I stated previously, a strong, healthy, robust middle class is the backbone of a nation, and this can track right back to Aristotle and the erosion of the American middle class, it becomes fundamental to say that we want to preserve the strength of the middle class, and we want to preserve particularly the strength and vitality of the existing American middle class. We want to lift people into the middle class who are poor, but we don't want to import a foreign middle class into our country and call that a day. We want to concern ourselves with the people who are in the middle class now and advancing their interests. And so he talks about the phrase he uses is a long countermarch through the institutions of the dominant elite. Universities, think tanks and foundations, schools, the arts, journalism, organized religion, the professions, labor organizations, and corporations. So this is a throwback to the long march through the institutions, which I'm not going to get into a whole lot of detail. I have an understanding of this, but I don't know as though I have a deep enough understanding that I want to get into it at this time. But essentially, there was what was referred to as the long march through the institutions that has been going on in this country for 80 years, as essentially it was rooted in communism. American communists attempted to take over the institutions of American society. That was the long march through the institutions, and it's been going on for a long time. So people today who may not call themselves communists are still following along this same path, and it's the left, and they seek to seize control of American institutions, and they've done so. And so while they move into institutions and the institution is open to allow them in, once they're in, they close it so that hiring committees, boards of directors, etc., all of the different institutions and levers of power in American society become more and more dominated by the left, because they're allowed into these levels of authority, but they don't allow anyone else in but more leftists. Their objective is not to fulfill the stated objective of the institution. Like for a university, their objective is not to foster an environment of open exchange of ideas and enhance the learning of the students and the research into new fields of study. Their objective is to use the university to advance the leftist agenda. Those are not the same thing, and their actions will not be the same. That is the long march through the institution. It's a long, slow, deliberate takeover of American society by communists and quasi-communists or the progressive left. That's what it is, and that's what has happened. And so Sam Francis, the author of this, is essentially proposing what I think is fundamentally necessary, which is a long countermarch through the institutions to recognize what has happened and reclaim these institutions in whatever way possible, and no longer look at these institutions as open areas for debate. They are tools for control. And that's the sad fact, but that's the fact. And we on the right have been asleep at the wheel while the left has taken control of these institutions and used them to sculpt the minds of the American people by spoon-feeding us progressive doctrine day in and day out. And so it becomes necessary to reclaim control of these institutions in order to save our nation. Now, there's a dispute. Some would push for what's referred to as the Benedict option, which is essentially withdrawal. That society, the left, has gotten too much power, the institutions are beyond repair, and we need to completely extract ourselves from them and build new communities and build new institutions. I find that very naive. But in some sense, I think it's necessary for people to isolate themselves to a degree in order to have the freedom to be able to pass on their ideas to their children without having them constantly be bombarded with leftism. I can see the drive and the desire, and maybe it's important, but if that's the only option left, it's over. It's game over. They're not going to leave you alone. If you think that you're going to go have some community somewhere where you're going to be able to raise your kids the way that you want them to be raised, you're going to be able to isolate yourselves, it doesn't work like that. You think there were pockets of isolated communities in the Soviet Union who followed some pre-Soviet way of life or rejected communism in their little communities? No. They will not let you have a little community. And so you need to recognize the levers of power, and you need to fight for them. And that's the point that he's making in that section. And I also like at the end when he talks about how the new nationalism is going to kind of combine republicanism with nationalism. And this kind of gets to something that I don't know if you're familiar with this, but at the National Conservatism Conference that happened recently, Patrick Deneen gave a speech. You can look it up on YouTube. It's pretty interesting, but he's the only one really at this conference who gave a warning and said, hey, nationalism is all about the nation, and we need to consider those entities which are below the nation, the regions, the local communities that could be crushed underfoot by a hegemonic nationalism. And so Francis is proposing essentially that nationalism, this new nationalism as he calls it, must balance these two things and incorporate both a localism and then an overarching nationalism that protects and fosters the localism, but prevents but stands firm and united against the globalism. Okay? So it's kind of two fronts. Anyway, that's a real interesting essay. The whole book is real interesting. The essays that I didn't read are also very interesting. And I recommend, if you are interested in paleoconservatism, this is a good book to have on your shelf. The Paleoconservatives. And so I guess I'm going to wrap it up now. I advise you to have a look at my social media pages where you can find out when I have new episodes out, or you can follow me on Google Play or on iTunes, on CastBox, on Stitcher. I have a Twitter page, I have a Facebook page. You can search for Neofusionist. It's pretty easy to find. I have a Patreon page if you like the show and you want to be a contributor. Hopefully soon I'm going to set up a simple donate page so that you don't have to go in and become an actual patron with these regular payments. If you just like the episode, you like what I'm doing, you want to drop me $10 or something, but you don't want to sign up to Patreon, hopefully soon I have that all set up. I don't have it set up yet, but I will let you know when I do. Anyway, thank you for tuning in and bearing with me through this rather extended episode, and I hope that you tune in next time. We've got some really good books in the near future, and I can't wait to get to them, and I think you'll enjoy them. So that's all for now. Bye.